Africa, 1940. Italy is preparing to bring World War II here, too, to a continent already scarred by decades of colonial rule. Yet this is no simple clash of armies. It is a contest for control of a geopolitical chessboard. The British Empire rules more than 5 million square kilometers in Africa, nearly 20 times the area of the British Isles. Its domain stretches from Egypt to Kenya, spanning eastern and western Africa alike. France administers roughly 7 million square kilometers, from North Africa to the colonies of the Sahel and interior south of the Sahara, an immense belt almost as large as Australia. Italy, for its part, lays claim to more than 3 million square kilometers. Libya on the Mediterranean and Italian East Africa. Eritrea, Somalia, and Ethiopia, conquered and proclaimed an empire in 1936, a vast expanse fully 10 times the size of the Italian peninsula altogether. 3 empires, millions of kilometers to hold, defend, or lose. But it is not merely a matter of flags. At stake lie strategic resources, vital trade routes, and global prestige. Across the desert and on the seas, firm control of ports, roads, supply depots, and the skies themselves will ultimately decide who expands and who topples. On the eve of war, the armed forces present on the African continent were diverse and spread across enormous territories. The British, supported by a multinational Commonwealth army, fielded about 36,000 men in Egypt. British, Indian, and South African regiments charged with defending the Suez Canal and crucial links along the Red Sea and into the Indian Ocean. In Sudan and Kenya, several thousand additional troops were on hand to shield the colonial borders. France, despite being battered by the European campaign, still maintained garrisons in North and West Africa, especially in Algeria and Senegal, amounting to tens of thousands of soldiers guarding its imperial frontiers. On the opposite side, Italy relied on 2 main strongholds. In Libya, it stationed roughly 215,000 troops, fewer than half Italian, and the remainder in Libyan battalions, while in East Africa, more than 90,000 Italian soldiers and over 200,000 locally recruited indigenous troops stood ready. This second front, Eritrea, Somalia, and Ethiopia, spanned territories so vast and remote that supplying them was difficult. Naval power was just as decisive. The Royal Navy, boasting more than 45 warships, including battleships, cruisers, and destroyers, operated from Alexandria and ruled most of the eastern Mediterranean. The Italian Regia Marine, for its part, possessed 6 operational battleships, among them the new Littorio and Vittorio Veneto, 7 heavy cruisers, 12 light cruisers, over 120 destroyers and torpedo boats, and more than 100 submarines. Yet these forces were scattered among the Tyrrhenian Sea, Sicily, Libya at Tripoli and Benghazi, and far-flung East Africa. The most powerful units, particularly the battleships, stayed concentrated at Taranto and La Spezia. The danger of a British blockade loomed large, for it could sever Italy's lifelines and undermine the defensive system. In the end, victory would belong to whoever kept the sea lanes under their command, or at least held them open long enough. In late spring 1940, Europe teetered through dramatic hours. France collapsed under the German advance, while an isolated Britain fought desperately to defend its naval and commercial lifelines. As the continent's maps were swiftly redrawn within weeks, Benito Mussolini glimpsed a window of opportunity. Entering the war now might let Italy rise as a truly first-rank power, seize new territories, and turn the Mediterranean into his very own Mare Nostrum. With every passing day, the moment grew more critical. Mussolini was convinced the war would be brief and that striking a Britain already on the ropes would yield victory without excessive sacrifice. On 10 June 1940 came the announcement. Italy declared war on France and Britain. The decision, taken in a climate of exultation, ignored one vital fact. The United Kingdom possessed a fleet and bases throughout the Mediterranean. Mussolini's first major aim was to strangle Britain's sea lanes from Gibraltar to Suez. He believed that swiftly occupying key territories would close every escape to London. Yet he underestimated British sea and air resistance and the coming clashes in North Africa, a reckless gamble that would reshape the fate not only of the Mediterranean, but of the entire African theater.
Did you know that most people who watch our documentaries aren't subscribed yet? If you enjoy animated maps and history, join our community. Leave a like and subscribe so you never miss the next episodes.
On 11 June 1940, only hours after declaring war, the first skirmishes flared in North Africa along the border between Libya and British-held Egypt, centered on Bardia, Fort Capuzzo, and British patrols based at Sollum. Italian infantry and armored detachments probed the defenses at Sidi Omar and Sidi Aziz, yet a true forward offensive stalled amid logistical shortages. Transport vehicles, fuel, and effective coordination with Libya's ports, Tripoli above all, plus Benghazi and the smaller harbors of Cyrenaica, and desert airstrips were all in critically short supply. Meanwhile, in Italian East Africa, General Nassi and the Duke of Aosta launched swift raids to widen their security belt. The seizure of Kassala in Sudan and Moyal in Kenya aimed to disrupt British supply lines, secure outposts, and consolidate permanent Italian possession over the rugged frontier landscape. London's reaction came quickly. Concerned for the safety of the Suez Canal and the sea lanes to India, the British reinforced Mersa Matruh, a key coastal node in Egypt. Simultaneously, the Royal Navy stepped up patrols across the Mediterranean, hunting Italian convoys bound for Libya and East Africa. Between June and July 1940, the first major naval clash occurred. In the Battle of Punta Stilo on 9 July, the Regia Marina, escorting convoys toward Benghazi and Tobruk, engaged the Royal Navy. Although the encounter proved indecisive, it inaugurated a long maritime tug-of-war. To this were added Allied air raids and a light blockade of ports such as Tobruk and Benghazi, measures that further complicated Italian offensive plans and stretched already fragile supply lines across the desert. Meanwhile, British signals intelligence began tracking Axis traffic. On 13 September 1940, acting on Mussolini's direct order, Marshal Rodolfo Graziani launched the invasion of Egypt from the Italian positions at Bardia and Sollum, straddling the Libyan-Egyptian frontier. About 70,000 men moved forward, backed by several hundred artillery pieces and a contingent of light L-3 and M1139 tanks, though in limited numbers. The thrust aimed for Sidi Barrani, more than 100 kilometers beyond the border, driven by the belief that the British force in the sector, then estimated at 36,000 effectives, could offer no serious resistance. The Italian High Command expected a swift breakthrough. The Italian units reached their initial objectives, yet instead of pushing on toward Mersa Matruh as Mussolini wished, Graziani halted the offensive. Rather than a quick capture of the delta, he ordered a broad chain of scattered fortified camps in the desert, intending to fully consolidate gains. This decision slowed the Italian initiative and gave the British time to reorganize, laying the groundwork for a powerful eventual counteroffensive that would not be long in coming. This strategic pause stemmed largely from logistical difficulties. Seaborne supply lines were thin because convoys were not adequately protected by the Regia Marina. The ports of Benghazi and Tobruk came under constant pressure from the Royal Navy, and daily air raids added further strain. With the Libyan desert behind them, supplying an advancing army became exceedingly complex. The challenges facing Italy increased dramatically with the attack on the Taranto during the night of 11 to 12 November 1940. British torpedo bombers taking off from the HMS Illustrious struck the Italian fleet anchored in the Apulian harbor, crippling the battleships Littorio, Conte di Cavour, and Calo Duilio. The surprise blow upended the balance in the Mediterranean. The Regia Marina, until then a serious threat, drastically reduced its sorties and found it far harder to shield convoys bound for North Africa. The operation's result demonstrated the effectiveness of air raids against capital ships and marked a decisive turning point in the struggle for control of the sea lanes vital to Italy's wider war effort. As a consequence, the supply lines from Sidi Barrani and the entire Egyptian front grew even more vulnerable. With Malta firmly in British hands, the Royal Air Force and Royal Navy dominated the waters between the island and Cyrenaica, inflicting mounting losses on Italian convoys. Without adequate naval support, the Egyptian campaign was becoming increasingly and critically untenable. By December 1940, the North African balance was tilting sharply against Italy. Under General Archibald Wavell, the British planned Operation Compass with a force of about 36,000 men supported by more than 200 tanks, many of them formidable Matilda II. Their aim was to exploit Italy's already fragile supply lines, coordinating army and navy to choke seaborne deliveries. From their base at Marsa Matra, British troops prepared to strike the fortified camps between Sidi Barrani and Bardia, where some 80,000 Italian soldiers, often poorly equipped and backed by only a limited number of M1139 and L3 armored vehicles, held the line. RAF planes were poised to pound any retreat along the coast. The operation opened with a surprise on 8 December 1940. A first decisive blow fell on the strong points of Nibioa and Tumar, whose Italian defense collapsed in a few hours. The advance rolled on toward Bardia, taken on 5 January 1941, and thence to Tobruk. Thousands of Italian soldiers, including many colonial troops, were captured, while losses in equipment and guns ran into the hundreds. The collapse of the defensive line cleared the road to Cyrenaica, putting Benghazi itself at direct risk. Meanwhile, in Italian East Africa, the attrition continued. British forces from Sudan and Kenya, tens of thousands of men, threatened the remaining Italian supply routes on the Red Sea. The fall of Kassala and Galabat, followed by advances into Eritrea and Ethiopia, comprised an entire front of about 90,000 Italian soldiers and 200,000 locally raised troops, hard-won but weakening Italian positions. The naval repercussions were equally disastrous. The Royal Navy, backed by aircraft based on Malta, intensified even more crushing attacks on Italian convoys in the Sicilian Channel and along the routes to Tripoli and Benghazi. As strongholds in Cyrenaica fell one by one, the central Mediterranean became almost entirely a British domain. Deprived of adequate supplies, Italy was forced to slash its ambitions in North Africa, flinging the door wide open to direct German intervention. Politically, the arrival of German forces marked Mussolini's admission that Italy could not sustain the North African War alone. Operational command effectively passed to General Erwin Rommel, whose audacious tactics and personal charisma would re-energize the fighting on the Libyan-Egyptian front. Yet the German intervention highlighted Italy's loss of strategic autonomy, underscoring a political defeat for Mussolini. Rome, once determined to dictate events, now found itself relegated to a merely supporting role. In the next episode, we will meet Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, feared, admired, and at the heart of some of World War II's most controversial chapters. Erwin Rommel, the legendary Wehrmacht general, left an indelible mark on North Africa's vast desert. After winning fame and respect in the lightning French campaign in May and June 1940, where he smashed Belgian and French defenses while commanding the 7th Panzer Division with unrivaled military genius, so swift and elusive it earned the nickname Ghost Division. He was handpicked by Hitler for an almost desperate mission: to reverse the Axis fortunes on a neglected front, the African desert. At Mersa Brega, Tobruk, Gazala, and Ain el-Ghazala, Rommel earned a sobriquet that became forever renowned: the Desert Fox. How did Rommel truly change the fate of an entire front? And how could he craft epic tactics in a place where no one wished to fight? At the start of 1941, with the Italian army in full route across Cyrenaica, Mussolini sent Hitler an urgent plea for assistance. The Wehrmacht, at first reluctant to divert forces from the Eastern Front being readied for Operation Barbarossa, feared that a total Axis collapse in the Mediterranean would seriously jeopardize strategic balance. After several meetings in which Mussolini stressed the crisis and the danger of losing Benghazi, Hitler agreed to act. On 11 January, the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht issued the order to create the Deutsche Afrika Korps, and on 12 February, General Erwin Rommel landed at Tripoli with the first elements of the 5th Light Division, the future 21st Panzer Division. About 16,000 men arrived, equipped with 120 tanks, including 45 Panzer III and 20 Panzer IV, plus many Panzer II and a handful of Czech-built Panzer 38T. Within the Italian High Command, relief at finally receiving modern weapons mingled with some fear of heavy political German interference. In parallel, the First Convoy War of February began. Italian-German transports, escorted by the Regia Marina, sailed from Italian ports through hazardous waters towards Tripoli, braving British submarines and vigilant craft based on Malta. Without secure control of the central Mediterranean, the newborn Afrika Korps could not sustain its presence in Libya for long, let alone contemplate offensive operations amid the desert sands. In March, Erwin Rommel launched his counteroffensive from the El Aguila line, where Italian and German forces had regrouped after landing at Tripoli. Despite British reinforcements in Cyrenaica, the Afrika Korps' rapid dash under the scorching Libyan sun completely astonished observers. By tightly coordinating armor with truck-borne infantry, Rommel broke the enemy lines at Mersa and Ajdabiya. Within weeks, Benghazi was once again captured by the Axis, compelling the British to fall back eastward toward the Egyptian frontier. Yet Tobruk, a vital harbor, soon emerged as the true obstacle. Its Australian garrison, tens of thousands strong, erected formidable defenses and imposed a long siege that would drag on for month after punishing month. Without possession of Tobruk, Rommel could not move safely toward Egypt. What had seemed a series of lightning victories stalled into a truly grueling, morale-sapping deadlock. Meanwhile, events in Italian East Africa were collapsing utterly. After the falls of Keren and Intria and Asmara in early April, British forces, about 70,000 regular and colonial troops, marched on Addis Ababa. Within months, more than 200,000 Italian soldiers and African Askari were taken prisoner, effectively ending the long-prized Ethiopian Empire. Fascist prestige suffered a heavy blow, and Italian attention drifted away from the North African front precisely when maximum combined effort was required to break Tobruk's impasse. In just 24 hours during the Battle of Cape Matapan, 27 through 29 March, the Royal Navy inflicted grievous and irrevocable losses on the Regia Marina. After an initial daylight clash involving the battleship Vittorio Veneto, the night of 28 March proved decisive. Italian forces outright lost 3 heavy cruisers, Zara, Flume, and Pola, and 2 destroyers, Vittorio Alfieri and Giosuè Carducci, with more than 2,000 sailors killed. On 16 April, during the Battle of Targio Convoy, Italian escort units clashed with British destroyers off the Kerkena Islands near the Tunisian coast. The convoy, 5 merchantmen bound for Tripoli and 3 destroyers, Lucatargio, Lampo, and Balegno, was almost completely annihilated. All 3 warships were sunk, and every transport was either sent to the bottom or crippled beyond repair. The British lost only the destroyer HMS Mohawk, yet the overall damage to the Axis was immense. fuel, ammunition, vital medical supplies, spare tank parts, and vehicles intended for both Italian troops and Rommel's desert formations never reached the front lines of the campaign. With the arrival of summer 1941, the Axis' chief concern was supplying the Afrika Korps with fuel, ammunition, and spare parts. At the same time, General Ettore Bastico, newly appointed Supreme Commander of Libyan forces, strove to sustain the Italian divisions: Trento, Brescia, Pavia, and the armored Arete, all equally reliant on constant resources to remain operational. From Malta, the Royal Navy launched unceasing strikes against Axis convoys headed for Tripoli and Benghazi. British aircraft and submarines based on the island sent an ever-growing number of freighters to the bottom, making the daily logistical outlook increasingly precarious for Rommel and his Italian partners. Weighing even more heavily was the striking power of Britain's fleet carriers: Ark Royal, Illustrious, Eagle, and Formidable, each able to launch 30 to 50 aircraft, including Sea Hurricane fighters, Fairey Fulmar reconnaissance planes, and venerable Swordfish torpedo bombers. Crewed by between 1,000 and 1,500 highly trained men and armed with powerful medium-caliber anti-aircraft guns of 4.5 or 4.7 inches, these ships allowed the Royal Navy to coordinate precision air raids against convoys while simultaneously covering its own supply routes. Operations such as Substance in July 1941 saw Ark Royal and sister vessels escort reinforcement convoys to Malta, thereby further strengthening Britain's overall offensive capacity in the central Mediterranean, tightening the noose around Axis shipping lanes, and steadily eroding Italian naval morale. In eastern Libya, roughly 150 kilometers west of the Egyptian frontier, Tobruk jutted around an inlet formed by the Italians during the 1930s. The port, a crucial node for resupply and coastal control, was ringed by nearly 50 kilometers of heights, trenches, and well-sited concrete bunkers, anti-tank ditches, and minefields, and defended by more than 25,000 stubborn troops of Australia's 9th Division with attached British support units. Between May and August 1941, Rommel ordered several assaults to smash the garrison and open the way to Egypt, yet the coordinated fire of anti-tank guns and heavy artillery repelled every breakthrough attempt. The German armored divisions, still boasting dozens of Panzer III and IV, suffered steady attrition from shortages of spare parts, fuel, and ammunition, and inflicted mounting casualties on tanks and crews alike. Attacks focused mainly on the southern perimeter and on coastal access points, but the Australians mounted effective counterstrokes, guided by aerial observation and a carefully planned network of intersecting fires that blunted each Axis drive. This blend of terrain and layered fortifications made Tobruk a fortress hard to storm. Rommel's failure to seize the harbor halted his advance toward Egypt and forced the Afrika Korps into a prolonged siege. With autumn's arrival, the North African front shifted dramatically. General Archibald Wavell, widely blamed for losing much of Cyrenaica, was relieved and replaced by Claude Auchinleck as overall commander of British Desert Forces campaigning. Simultaneously, the British 8th Army in Egypt received substantial reinforcements. Thousands of infantry from India, South Africa, and New Zealand were joined by new tanks such as the Matilda, the Valentine, and the faster Crusader, plus artillery, engineers, and logistics units. By October, the 8th Army then possessed considerably more than 400,000 operational armored fighting vehicles, far outstripping those available to the Afrika Korps. The strategic priority was clear: free Tobruk and drive the Axis back beyond Cyrenaica. To that end, Auchinleck launched Operation Crusader on 18 November, aiming to break the months-long siege and deal Rommel's divisions a blow that would restore the initiative to the British once and for all. In the clashes at Sidi Rezik and Bir al-Gubi, British, South African, and New Zealand units met the tenacity of the Afrika Korps and its Italian allies. Though numerically inferior, the Germans exploited surprise and desert experience, yet shortages of fuel and spares crippled the divisions. Meanwhile at sea, decisive encounters unfolded. On 8 to 9 November, the Duisburg convoy took place in the central Mediterranean roughly 100 miles east of Lampedusa, in a night action lit by star shells and burning oil. British destroyers from Malta surprised and destroyed an Axis convoy carrying vital fuel and stores for Rommel. Tankers and transports were sunk, robbing the Afrika Korps of petrol, ammunition, and food. A few weeks later, on 17 December, the First Battle of Sirte ended inconclusively, yet underscored Britain's resolve to hamper Axis resupply bound for Tripoli and Benghazi at every opportunity. In 6 weeks, Operation Crusader achieved its principal purpose. The garrison of Tobruk was relieved, and Rommel compelled to retreat to El Agheila, the line from which he had advanced in spring earlier that same year, leaving a still undaunted Axis. The dream of reaching Egypt in 1941 evaporated, while the Regia Marina, weakened by convoy losses, could not sustain further expansion in North Africa. By year's end, most of Cyrenaica lay under British control, leaving the Axis in weaker positions and foreshadowing brutal future battles in 1942. By the end of 1941, neither side had secured a decisive victory in North Africa. Although the British Eighth Army had broken the siege of Tobruk and driven the Afrika Korps back to El Agheila, Rommel still commanded a formidable force capable of regrouping and launching new offensives. Estimates placed the strength of the Eighth Army at 100,000 men and 350 to 400 tanks, whereas the Afrika Korps and attached Italian units mustered 60 to 70,000 effectives, with fewer than 150 serviceable armored vehicles. In essence, both armies were exhausted after months of desert fighting and lacked the means to deliver a final blow. In East Africa, by contrast, Italy's defeat was now total. With the falls of Asmara and Addis Ababa, the colonial empire ceased to exist as an organized entity. The remaining Italian garrisons scattered into mountain outposts or surrendered. The disaster drained resources and gravely damaged fascist propaganda already severely weakened by reverses in Cyrenaica. As 1941 closed, the campaign entered stalemate. Yet Rommel was far from beaten. In 1942, he would attempt the most daring advance of the Desert War, thrusting to Egypt's very doorstep, hoping to seize victory there. In the Sahara in 1942, Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, pushed the Italian-German forces to within a step of the Suez Canal. Through lightning assaults and fragile supply lines, the Axis looked poised for triumph, until Allied naval power, anchored on the beleaguered Malta, upended every forecast. From the swift fall of Tobruk to the decisive clash at Alamein and the U.S. landings of Operation Torch, the African front became a stage of courage and collapse. How did the Axis nearly win in such a hostile land? And why did the Allies reverse its course with one crushing stroke? Was the last move decided in scorching dunes or in the embattled ports of the Mediterranean? At the start of 1942, the Axis still seemed in retreat after Operation Crusader. The depleted Italian-German forces, short of fuel, withdrew to El Agheila, while the British advanced cautiously. For every mile they pushed in Cyrenaica, their own supply lines grew longer. In that critical interval, the Italian Navy carried out 3 decisive convoy runs, all headed for Tripoli. Convoy M43 left Naples and Messina on 5 January, reached Tripoli on the 7th, unloading tankers of vital fuel and ammunition. Convoy T-16 sailed from Taranto on 22 January, slipped through the Strait of Messina, and entered harbor on the 24th laden with guns and rations. Convoy T-18, departed Taranto on the night of 16 February, crossed the Sicilian Channel, and on the 18th, discharged petrol for the panzer divisions together with a load of spare parts. Though harassed by Malta-based aircraft and British submarines, these three convoys delivered about 30,000 tons of fuel, food, and ammunition. Far from plentiful, yet more than enough to revive the Afrika Korps and the Italian Ariete and Trieste divisions. Resupplied, Rommel seized the moment. In mid-February, he unleashed a lightning strike. Agidabia and Elagelia fell back into Axis hands, forcing the British to pull hurriedly eastward. Scattered across a vast desert front, the garrisons failed to form a coherent line. Once more, much of Cyrenaica returned to Italian-German control, overturning London's grim expectations. At sea, the outlook stayed critical but not hopeless. Despite Malta's constant menace, the Regia Marina and Kriegsmarine shepherded further vital cargoes into Tripolitania, maintaining a fragile lifeline. German U-boats and Italian submarines prowled between Bardia and Benghazi, sinking Allied ships and slowing enemy traffic. These naval successes, coupled with Rommel's renewed dash, allowed the Axis to seize back the initiative, living proof that even a few well-protected convoys could still decisively determine the ultimate fate of a hard-fought entire desert campaign. At the start of spring 1942, Erwin Rommel and General Ettore Bastico, commander of the Italian forces in Libya, reorganized the Italian-German units deployed in eastern Cyrenaica. The Axis line now counted roughly 99,000 men, just over half of them German, supported by about 560 tanks, some 330 Panzer III and IV in the Afrika Korps, and 230 M1340 and M1441 with the Italian armored formations. The Ariete Division under General Giuseppe De Stefanis and the Trieste Division, led by General Arnaldo Azzi, were fully woven into Rommel's operational scheme. Facing them, the British 8th Army mustered about 114,000 soldiers, more than 800 Crusader, Grant, Valentine, and Matilda tanks, and some 600 aircraft. To blunt any Axis drive, the British transformed the Gazala line into a thick belt of minefields and fortified boxes, while the French Free Brigade at Bir Hakeim prepared to hold out to the last man. The Battle of Gazala opened 26 May, when Rommel launched a sweeping southern flanking move aimed at encircling the enemy's defensive corps. Ferocious fighting raged around Bir Hakeim, where General Marie-Pierre Koenig's brigade stood firm until 10 June, stubbornly delaying the Axis advance. Despite that resistance, the Ariete Division broke through on the northern flank with decisive support from German panzers, inflicting heavy, crippling losses in men and frontline armor on the British formations. On 21 June, Rommel and Bastico ordered the final assault on Tobruk. Within 24 hours, the fortress fell. Roughly 35,000 Allied soldiers were captured, along with vast stocks of supplies and artillery. The lightning seizure of the port, crucial to controlling North Africa, astonished even the German high command. Hitler promptly promoted Rommel to field marshal in recognition of his strategic skill. The Italian divisions, often equipped with less modern tanks than the panzers, nonetheless played a major operational role and gained unprecedented prestige thereafter. With Tobruk firmly in Axis hands, the Afrika Korps pressed east toward Marsa-Matra and Alexandria, directly menacing Egypt's heart. For London, it was a bitter blow. Churchill faced a storm of fierce criticism at home, while the Desert War braced itself for its most dramatic act. In June 1942, after Tobruk's fall, Axis forces surged eastward. Within weeks, Rommel's Afrika Korps, together with Italian divisions, reached the El Alamein zone, scarcely 100 kilometers from Alexandria. The vital Suez Canal, artery of British Empire trade, now seemed exposed to direct assault. General Claude Auchinleck nevertheless anchored a solid, interlocking defensive system between the Mediterranean shore and the vast Qattara Depression, forging a natural barrier extremely difficult for mechanized armor to outflank or swiftly bypass. The First Battle of El Alamein began on 1 July and dragged on for most of the month. Italo-German formations, eager to push through Egypt's gateway, soon ran short of fuel and spare parts, while the British endured punishing attrition in the line. Across the Mediterranean, Royal Air Force and Royal Navy units stepped up attacks on Axis convoys departing Italy and Greece, making supplies ever rarer. Neither Rommel nor Auchinleck gained a decisive advantage. The opposing lines stiffened, and the Desert War slipped into a precarious deadlock. In August, dissatisfied with the lack of progress, Winston Churchill removed Auchinleck and appointed Bernard Montgomery to lead the Eighth Army. Thanks chiefly to the epic Pedestal Convoy, critical fuel and more than 250 brand-new M4 Sherman tanks reached Egypt's ports. Heartened by these reserves, the Allies at last gained the clear numerical edge they had sought for months. Methodical, meticulous, and resolute, Montgomery began a thorough reorganization, welding infantry, artillery, engineers, and armor into a tightly integrated force poised for the decisive autumn battle. Rommel, meanwhile, lingered near El Alamein, knowing that only a steady flow of supplies could power a fresh drive toward Alexandria and the Suez Canal. With the Regia Marina struggling and the Kriegsmarine scarcely present in the Mediterranean, the Axis found it hard to maintain the logistics needed for a rapid offensive. Thus, summer 1942 closed in stalemate, but the coming clash would decide the fate of the entire North African front. The Second Battle of El Alamein, fought from 23 October to 4 November 1942, opened with Operation Lightfoot, a massive night bombardment followed by infantry pushing lanes through Axis minefields. On the British line, roughly 220,000 men and almost 1,000 tanks faced just over 100,000 Italian-German soldiers with 500 armored vehicles. After 12 days of assaults, artillery barrages, and dueling armored columns, the toll was grim. More than 17,000 killed or wounded and over 30,000 prisoners, almost all on the Axis side. The Afrika Korps lost around 450 tanks. The Eighth Army left barely more than 200 on the field, yet retained crushing superiority. In the skies, Allied fighters and bombers compounded Axis setback. Short of fuel and spares, Rommel ordered withdrawal toward Libya, abandoning tons of ammunition and equipment to the sand during the blazing daylight advance. For the Allies, it was the first large ground victory against German troops. On 10 November, in the House of Commons, Winston Churchill exulted, "Before Alamein, we never had a victory. After Alamein, we never had a defeat." With the Axis wrecked and almost its entire tank park destroyed, overall strategic initiative passed irrevocably to the Allies. Rommel faced a grim retreat of more than 2,000 kilometers. The Axis had lost momentum, while Montgomery's columns pushed purposefully into Cyrenaica. Only days later, on 8 November 1942, the decisive blow arrived with Operation Torch, an Allied landing of 105,000 troops supported by more than 500 escort ships in a major amphibious assault. 3 separate forces spearheaded the landings. The Western Task Force, 35,000 Americans under George S. Patton, sailed from Norfolk, crossed the Atlantic, and struck Casablanca. The Central Task Force, with 39,000 troops led by Lloyd Fredenhall, left Scotland's Clyde, steered the Atlantic track southward, and stormed the beaches of Arzew and Oran. The Eastern Task Force, 31,000 British, American, and Free French under Kenneth Anderson, also cleared the Clyde, hugged Portugal's coastline, slipped through the Strait of Gibraltar, and came ashore at Sidi and Algiers. Their convoys braved gales, U-boats, and Luftwaffe reconnaissance throughout the long approach toward Gibraltar. Covering those armadas were 3 fleet carriers, 4 escort carriers, 2 battleships, 7 cruisers, and more than 60 destroyers, while over 250 LCVP landing craft churned the final miles toward the beaches. Vichy forces resisted only a few hours. Most units surrendered or joined the Allies, allowing a rapid seizure of the vital ports with almost no additional bloodshed. With these converging thrusts, the Anglo-Americans threatened Libya and Tunisia from the west, while Montgomery pressed from the east. The Axis found itself caught between 2 fires, stripped of the operational freedom that had sustained earlier campaigns. After the defeat at El Alamein and the Anglo-American landings of Operation Torch, between December 1942 and January 1943, Rommel's Afrika Korps and Italian units blew up bridges, roads, and fuel dumps to deny them to the Allies. Rommel, weakened by malaria and continual disputes with Berlin, still commanded at the front. Yet, as he moved toward the Tunisian border, overall command passed to General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim, charged with defending the Axis' last stronghold in Africa amid mounting Allied pressure. In February 1943, the Battle of Kasserine Pass marked the first major clash between Germans and Americans. Rommel, leading a mixed Italian-German force, scored a tactical success against an inexperienced U.S. Army. Yet shortages of fuel and reserves prevented turning victory into strategic breakthrough. A few days later, the field marshal, physically worn and convinced the campaign was untenable, was recalled to Berlin for health reasons, leaving Africa on 9 March. Southern Sector Command passed to General Giovanni Messe, while von Arnim retained overall authority for Army Group Africa. Berlin hoped new leadership and revised defensive plans might stabilize crumbling Tunisia. Meanwhile, Montgomery pressed from the east. On 23 January, he entered Tripoli, depriving the Axis of its last supply port. In March, the Battle of Medellin failed to halt the Allied advance, and the breach of the Mareth Line, from 17 to 23 March, forced Axis troops back on Tunis and Bizerte. April opened the final act. With Operation Vulcan on 22 April, the Allies struck on every axis. German and Italian formations, without fuel or ammunition, could not contain the onslaught. Tunis and Bizerte fell on 7 May, and between 12 and 13 May, more than 275,000 Axis soldiers laid down their arms. The African War was over. In a little more than 2 years, the Axis had lost every colony, while the Allies gained the perfect springboard for invading Sicily and opening a new front in Europe against battered Axis holdouts. If this journey through the African campaign intrigued you, truly subscribe to the channel, ring the bell so you never miss upcoming episodes, leave a like, and share the video. Thanks for watching. The story continues.